Welcome to Module 2, Cost Classification, Behavior, and Purpose. At the end of this module, you should be able to define and explain the various bases of cost classification. You should be able to understand the various cost and responsibility centers used in an organization, such as cost centers, cost units, profit centers, revenue centers. Then you should be able to also explain the concepts of cost behavior. Then finally, you should be able to perform a calculation to distinguish between variable cost and fixed cost using the high and low method. So this module is one of the key modules in management accounting because a lot of the things we are going to be doing will relate to how we can classify costs so that we can determine the cost of a product, the cost of a service, or the cost of an activity. So when we say cost classification in a nutshell, what do we mean? But before we go to cost classification, let's first define what a cost is. So when we say cost, what is cost? When I say I spent, or it cost me $50 to go home or to get here this morning, or it cost me $50 to buy a device, what is the cost? A cost is simply the amount of expenditure that is incurred on an activity or an undertaking or a process. So a cost is simply the amount of expenditure that is incurred on an activity, a process, and then an undertaking. Now, when it comes to the total cost of a product, so for instance, if you should buy a house right now, or if you want to build your house right now, we want to find out what is the total cost of the house that you're going to build. You're going to buy land, you're going to buy cement, you're going to buy sand, you're going to maybe buy some blocks, you're going to buy some sand, you're going to buy stones, you're going to buy wood, or 2x4, whatever it is. You're going to buy roofing sheets, and you're going to buy a lot of things. So when you finish building your house, maybe the total cost you incurred in the building of your house, it's, let's say for instance, 60,000 Ghana cedis. So that total cost, what does it entails? So as management accountants, we are interested in finding out how we can categorize costs into various categories. So cost classification simply refers to the process of grouping of costs into various groups based on certain criteria or features or behavior of cost. So we want to look at how cost can be classified, and cost can be classified according to nature, according to behavior, according to function, among other things. So let me take you through how cost classification actually is. So first, cost can be classified according to nature. Now, classification of cost according to nature is simply where we classify cost into 1. Material cost, 2. Labor cost, and then 3. Expenses. So classification of cost according to nature simply refers to the amount of cost, or classifying cost into the various components of cost, like the material, like the labor, like the expenses. So back to the example of your house, that is costing us $60,000 after the end of the building. You're going to look at the material cost of the house. That is going to include the cement you bought, the roofing sheet, everything is going to come from the material cost. Then the labor cost will include the people you employ, the carpenters, the masons, the plumbers, in that. Then the expenses will be any other cost that you are going to incur in the building of your house. So let's delve deeper into what material cost usually is. Material cost is simply the cost of consumables that are used, or that is used in the production of goods and services. So the cost of the raw material, the cost of the resources that we use in the production of a product or in the rendering of service is what refers to as material cost. Labor cost, on the other hand, refers to the cost incurred for the usage of human efforts in the production process. In other words, labor costs include things like wages and salaries in that case. Expenses are simply all other costs that are incurred by an organization apart from material costs and then labor costs. Now, to be able to understand the classification of costs better, each of these costs can further be classified into what we call direct cost and then indirect cost. So what it means is that when it comes to material, we're going to have direct material cost and we're going to have indirect material cost. So we will have direct material cost and then indirect material cost. What is direct material cost? Usually, A direct cost is simply a cost that can be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. But indirect costs are costs that cannot be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. So if we are talking about direct material costs, we are talking about the cost of the raw materials, the cost of the consumables that are used in the production of goods and services that can be traced to a particular cost center or cost unit. Now, when we talk about cost center, a cost center can be a department, a cost center can be a production machine, a cost center can even be a process in an organization. So the cost that can be traced or allocated to department A or to machine A or to employee A, it's what we refer to as what? The direct cost, right? So indirect costs are, as I mentioned, costs that cannot be traced to a particular cost center or cost unit. So to be able to look at that, well, for instance, direct material cost, if let's say we are building our house, so the direct material cost in the building of the house will include the things that we buy, the materials we buy for the building of the house. So it will include the sand, it will include the stone, it will include the sandstone, cement, the roofing sheets, the wood. All these things will be referred to as what? Direct material cost. Why? Because we can trace those things directly to a particular thing. We can trace it directly to the building that has been established. But indirect material costs are the cost of material used in the production of goods and services or a process or an undertaking that cannot be really traced to the products under question. So if we go back to the building of our house, the money you paid for water, right, for the building of the house. Now that money you pay for the water, even though it's part of the material cost, we will classify it as what? Indirect material cost. So that is what you must understand when we come to direct material cost and then indirect material cost. When we come to labor cost also, we will have direct labor cost and indirect labor cost. So we're going to have direct labor cost and indirect labor cost. So the direct labor cost is simply the cost of human effort or the cost of labor that can be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. So back again to my building, to our building. The cost that you pay for the mason, for the plumbers, for the carpenters, in relation to the building of the house will relate to what we call direct labor cost. Why? Because we can actually trace their work to a finished product. We can actually look at the work that a carpenter did in relation to the roofing of the house. We can actually look at the work that a plumber did in relation to taking care of all the sewage systems in the house. Then we can also look at the work that the mason did in building the house. So the cost of labor that can be traced to a particular cost center or a cost unit is what we refer to as what? The direct labor cost. So indirect labor costs are simply the cost of the labor which cannot really be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. So for instance, the people you employ to fetch the water. So the water you are using to build a house is an indirect labor cost. But the people you employ to bring in the water will be directed, the money you are paying to them as part of the labor cost will be referred to as what? Indirect labor cost. Then finally we come to expenses. Expenses are all other costs that organization is incurring apart from material cost and labor cost. So expenses can include a lot of stuff. So with the expenses, so also you have direct expenses, DE, and then indirect expenses, IE. The direct expenses are the expenses, as always, that we can trace or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit, but the indirect expenses are the one that cannot be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. Now, to put this in perspective, you realize that we need to always calculate the total cost of a product, the total cost of a process, or the total cost of an undertaking. In that case, what we're going to do is that we're going to add the direct material cost, add the direct labor cost, add the direct expenses. When we add these three things, we are going to get what we call the prime cost. We are going to get the prime cost. Then the summation of the indirect cost, indirect labor, indirect material cost, indirect labor, and indirect expenses also is referred to as the overheads. So what is prime cost? Prime cost is the summation of all direct costs. Overheads refers to the summation of all indirect costs. So that is what you must understand when it comes to classification of cost by nature. Now let me also state here that there are differences between direct cost and then indirect cost. From the explanation I gave, one of the difference is that direct cost can be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit, but indirect cost cannot be traced or allocated to a particular cost center or cost unit. Also, you realize that direct cost or summation of direct cost gives us prime cost, but the summation of indirect cost gives us overhead. Also, direct costs can usually be controlled. So direct costs are usually controllable costs. We can determine how much material we want to use. We can determine how much we will pay for the labor, for the work that is being undertaken. So usually direct costs can be controllable, but indirect costs are uncontrollable because sometimes they are fundamental and you need to incur them and you don't have much control over them. Also, direct cost takes a greater proportion of the total cost of the product or the service, but indirect cost actually takes part of the or actually take a minimal part of the total cost of the undertaking or the product or the process we are producing. So, for instance, the total direct cost that we are going to be incurring for the production of our house, if it is $60,000, we may incur direct cost about 55,000 Ghana cedis or $55,000, but the $5,000 will be the indirect cost. So these are some of the things that you have to understand when we talk about differences between direct cost and then indirect cost. So for that, with that understanding at the back of your mind, under classification of cost according to nature, based on that we can prepare a cost card. Okay, so based on that we can prepare a cost card. A cost card is simply a record of all the costs that is incurred in the production of a product, undertaking of a process, or an undertaking as a different entity on its own. So when we are preparing a cost card, let me slot my currency sign up. I think I'll work with two currency signs with 3 zeros up, or yes, I can just leave it like that. The first thing we bring is our direct material cost, direct labor cost, direct expenses. Remember what I said, when you add direct material cost, direct labor, direct expenses, the figure you get is referred to as prime cost. Okay, it's referred to as prime cost. Then after getting this, what we bring is to bring what we call factory overheads. Now we will come to that in a moment. Factory overheads will be brought, and when we add factory overhead to the prime cost, we will get production cost. Then we bring non-production overheads. So non-production overheads. Now non-production overheads will include issues such as selling and distribution, administrative expenses, finances, okay, finance costs. So S&D, selling and distribution, admin expenses, any finance costs that organization incurs or finance overheads will be brought. Once that is brought, we get a total cost, or what we call the full cost of the product or the service. So these are what you must understand when it comes to the cost card. Now this is going to be fundamental because we are going to be using this almost throughout the syllabus, because understanding how direct costs are treated and how indirect costs are treated is very important to the determination of the cost of a product or the cost of a process. So that is the first thing about classification of cost by understanding how direct costs are treated and how indirect costs are treated is very important to the determination of the cost of a product or the cost of a process. So that is the first thing about classification of cost by nature. The second form of classification of cost is according to behavior. So first nature, second behavior. Classification of cost according to behavior is where we classify cost in relation to how it varies with output levels. Or when we say classification of cost according to behavior, it simply refers to classifying cost according to how the levels of output changes. So under this, we are going to have what we call fixed cost. We're going to have what we call variable cost. We're going to have what we call semi-fixed cost or semi-variable cost. And we're going to even have what we call step cost. So these are some classification module or classification ways in relation to how we classify cost according to behavior. Now, so what are fixed costs? Fixed costs are simply costs that remain the same irrespective of what? The output level. In other words, with fixed costs, even when the output level is 0, you will still incur the fixed cost. Fixed costs will include issues such as the rental you pay for the premises or the acquisition of a machine. So basically, when you are starting a business, the office that you rent, the machines you buy, the computers you buy, the systems you put in place, all these things are what? Fixed costs. So at 0 output, even if you have not, when you have not started producing anything yet, the fixed cost will still be incurred. Then we come to variable cost. Immediately you begin to produce or immediately you begin to operate, you are going to incur the variable cost. So variable cost is simply the cost that varies with what? Output level. The more output you produce, the more variable cost that you are going to incur. So variable costs usually take the form of material cost, labor cost, and other direct expenses. When we talk about variable cost, let's assume that you are building your house again, back to building your house again. So let's say you are building 5 houses. The cost you incur in building 5 houses will be different from the cost you incur in building 1 house. So that is what we refer to as what? Variable cost. The more you build or the more activities or the output level you produce, the more variable cost that you are going to incur in relation to that. Then the next thing there is semi-variable cost. Now, what is a semi-variable cost? A semi-variable cost is simply a cost that is partly fixed and partly what? Variable. So when we say a cost is semi-variable, it means that that cost contains some elements of fixed and some elements of variable. Let's look at some examples of that in your handouts. In the handouts I provided, I think I'll have some examples of that. Right, so with semi-variable cost, what we are saying here is that it has a mixture of fixed and variable. So example of semi-variable cost can include electricity and gas bill. Electricity and gas bill. The fixed cost will include a standing charge, that is what you are going to pay, and then the variable cost will include the charge per unit of the electricity that you used. Sales or salary, salesman salary. The salesman salary is also a semi-variable cost because the fixed component is the basic salary that you give to the salesman, but the variable component is the commission that is provided on every sale that a salesman makes. And then cost of running a car. The cost of running a car, the fixed component will be the road tax you pay and then the insurance that you pay on the vehicle. But the variable cost will be the cost of petrol, cost of repair in relation to that. So that is what you must understand when it comes to semi-variable cost. Then the next one is step cost. With step cost, what is happening here is that the cost remains the same, but when the activity level changes, the cost also changes. So it is more or less like this picture. It shows this picture. So it is fixed, but when the output changes, become variable, then it will be fixed, variable, it will be fixed. That is what we refer to as what? Step cost. So a step cost is a cost that remains fixed for a given output level, but when the output level changes, an additional cost is what? Incurred in that order. So for instance, we can say that when we produce 1,000 units in our organization, when we produce up to 1,000 units, so from 1 to 1,000, we're going to incur fixed machine cost of $5,000. That is a fixed machine cost. But immediately we decide to produce more than 1,000, then we need to bring in another machine. That means that the machine cost, when the output changes, has become what? Variable in that case. So these are what we refer to as classification of cost according to behavior. According to behavior. That is very important. Now, so the third slide we have there is to look at classification of cost according to function. Classification of cost according to function. Now, classification of cost according to function simply refers to classifying cost according to the various departments that exist within the organization. So classification of cost according to function is where we have administration overhead or administration cost, selling and distribution cost, finance costs in relation to that. So you are classifying the cost based on the departments or based on the functions that incur those costs. So for instance, if we want to classify costs according to function, we may have production cost or production overheads. Production overheads include all indirect material costs, indirect wages, and indirect expenses incurred in the factory from receipt of order until it's complete. So production overheads are that. We will classify that one there. Also, production overheads has an example of rent and rates, insurance of factory, depreciation, fuel, power, maintenance of plants and machinery, and building. All these are production overheads. What it means is that we are classifying the cost according to the function or according to the department. The second thing is to talk about administration overheads. Now, these are all indirect material costs, indirect labor costs, indirect expenses in the direction, control, and administration of an undertaking, a process, or a business. So an example of administration overheads can include depreciation of office building and equipment, office salaries including salary of directors and accountants, rent, rate, insurance, lighting, cleaning, telephone charges, and so on. So all these can also be referred to as administration overhead. Third is selling overhead. Selling overhead is simply all the indirect overhead incurred in promoting sales and retaining customers. So all the overheads that we're going to incur in relation to promoting the product and also retaining our customers will be classified under selling overheads. Example of selling overheads will include printing and stationery, such as catalogs, price lists, salaries and commissions of salesmen, representative and sales department staff, advertising and sales promotion and market research, as well as rent, rate, insurance of office and showrooms, bad debts, and so on. So all these can be classified under sales overheads. Then we can also have the distribution overhead. It is all the indirect costs incurred in making the packed products ready for dispatch and delivering it to customers. So all costs we incurred in packaging the product and then taking it to delivering it to the customers will come under distribution overhead. So that is classification of cost according to function. Remember, classification of cost according to nature is where we classify the cost into material cost, labor cost, and expenses. Classification of cost according to behavior is where we classify the cost into fixed cost, variable cost, semi-variable, and then step cost. Classification of cost according to function is where we classify the cost based on the functions that are related to undertaking various activities within the organization. Now, there are other forms of classification of cost that we can talk about. We can talk about production cost and then non-production cost, or production overheads and non-production overheads. This is where we classify the cost based on or according to whether the cost is associated with the direct production of the product. So if the cost is related to the direct production of the product or the direct rendering of the service, then we will classify that cost as what? A production cost. But any cost that is not incurred directly in the production of the product, like selling and distribution, like administration expenses, like finance costs, will be classified as non-production cost. So that is also another way cost can be classified. Another way that we can also classify cost is based on the controllability of cost. So we have controllable cost and then non-controllable cost. If you remember what I said under direct cost and indirect cost, we said that direct costs are controllable and indirect costs are non-controllable or uncontrollable. So these are some of the classification of cost that we need to understand. Certainly we have other terms also there as unavoidable cost. These are costs which would be incurred whether or not the activity or the sector existed. So unavoidable costs are what you will incur whether you undertake it or you don't undertake it. For instance, if you decide that you want to become a business leader or you want to charter as an accountant, when you decide, immediately you take the decision, then you would have to what? Make the journey and pay the money to the Institute of Chartered Accountants and register in that case. But if you decide not to do it, then it means you avoid the cost. But unavoidable cost here means that you're going to incur the cost whether you undertake the activity or you don't undertake the activity. So it is more or less like quote unquote a sunk cost or something like that. Then we have what we call discretional cost. These are costs that are likely to arise from the decision made during the budgeting process. So discretional costs can include advertising, training, research, and development. So these are what you must understand when it comes to classification of cost. Now let's look at some various terminologies that we use in cost accounting. I've already defined what a cost center is, a cost unit is, but let's spend some time and look at them in a bit detail. So cost centers are all collecting places for cost before they are further analyzed. So a cost center can include a department, a machine or a group of machines, a project, or the overhead cost that is in relation to rent and rates. So that is allocated to a particular department. So that is a cost center. A cost center, a place where cost will be collected before we can what? Allocate that cost or analyze the cost. So any place that we can allocate cost to is referred to as what? A cost center. So as I mentioned, a department can be a cost center. So the production department, all costs that we incur at the production department will be collected at the production department. That is a cost center. Or maybe our plants and in the factory, all costs we incur on the maintenance of plants, on fueling of the plants, on repairs of the plants will be collected at that place. So the group of machines upon which we are incurring the cost will be referred to as what? Cost centers. Then we have cost units. A cost unit is a unit of products to which cost may be related. Okay, so cost unit is simply the quantitative unit of a product to which cost may be related. Then we have cost object. A cost object is any activity for which a separate measurement of cost is desired. Then we have profit centers. A profit center is similar to a cost center, just that a profit center is accountable for both cost of the department and then revenue of the department. So in other words, it becomes a profit center. So we incur cost at that department, at the same time we receive some revenue of that department. So at the end of the day, we find out the profit or loss that has been made for the department. Revenue centers are similar to cost centers in that they only take care of what? Revenue that come into the business. Investment center is just like a profit center with an additional responsibility for capital investments and possibly for financing and whose performance is measured by its return on investment. So investment centers are like profit centers. We allocate costs to them, they receive revenue, but at the same time they make investment decisions relating to the business. Then finally we have the responsibility centers. A responsibility center is a department or organizational function whose performance is directly or is the direct responsibility of a specific manager. So basically a responsibility center takes that form in relation to that. Now, to conclude on this slide, what we're going to look at is how we can separate costs of products. So for instance, at the end of the day, back to my example on the house we are building, and you are incurring $60,000 in the building of your house. So at the end of the day, what we want to find out is what is the total cost that has been incurred, 60,000. But at the end of the day, we want to classify that cost into variable cost and fixed cost so that we can make decision about future production or future output. So how do we analyze cost into their fixed components and then their variable components? The analysis of costs into, that is total cost, into their fixed cost and their variable components, we will be going to use what we call the high and low method. So the high and low method will be used so that we can separate the cost between fixed and variable cost. Now, what is the high and low method? Now, the high and low method is simply used to determine the variable cost per unit of the products. Okay, so with a high and low method, your variable cost per unit, okay, it's going to be the total maximum cost minus total minimum cost divided by total maximum output or units minus total minimum output or units. So when you do this arithmetic, it's going to give you the variable cost per unit. Then you are going to apply that variable cost per unit on the maximum concepts. Then you are going to get your total fixed cost. Then you can now determine the total cost for an activity or a process. What do I mean by that? For instance, let's say we have outputs and we have total cost. So let's say that we have two levels of outputs, 1 and 2. The output, let's say this is 50,000 units and this is 75,000 units. And let's say the total cost at 50,000 units is, let's say, 600,000. And then let's say the total cost at the 75,000 units, it's, let's assume, 850,000 cedis. So this time, the examiner has given us only total cost. How do we separate that between the variable cost and then the fixed cost? To do that, that is where we use what? The high and low method. So using the high and low method, we're going to find the variable cost per unit. And as we said, the variable cost per unit is going to be the total maximum cost. If you look at it, this is the total maximum cost. That is going to be 850,000 minus the total minimum cost, and that is 600,000. Okay, divided by total maximum output, which is 75,000. Okay, minus 50,000. So when we do the arithmetic for this, that is what is going to give us the variable cost per unit. So we use the high and low method to separate the cost between what? Fixed cost and variable cost. Let's look at a question that I have put together in your handout so that we can see how we can solve that question. So example 1, high and low method. DK company has recorded the following total cost during the last 5 years. So we have the year there, then we have the units there, then we have total cost there. So 3 columns. Then we have from 20x0 to 20x4. So x0, x1, x2, x3, x4. So 5 years. Then under the output level, we have 65,000, 80,000, 90,000, 60,000, and 75,000 respectively for the years. Then we have the total cost segment, and we have 145,000, 162,000, 170,000, 140,000, and 160,000. What is the requirement? The examiner is asking us to calculate the total cost that should be expected in 20x5 if the output is 85,000 units. Right, so the examiner has given us the activities for the organization for the last 5 years, and then he is asking us to determine the total cost of producing 85,000 units next year. So the question is, we only have the output and we have total cost. So how do we now determine the total cost of producing the 85,000 units? So to do that, what we need to look at is to use our high and low method, as I mentioned. So in the usage of our high and low method, you remember I just said that the variable cost is equal to, the variable cost will be equal to the total maximum cost, okay, minus total minimum cost divided by maximum output or total maximum output minus minimum output or unit. So this is our formula, and that is what we are going to use to find the high and low method. So we need to go look at the 5 years that has been given to us and find out about the maximum cost and then the minimum cost. Definitely once we find the maximum cost, their corresponding outputs will be straight up given. So if you look at the question, the highest activity level is 20x2 and then the lowest activity level is 20x3. So the highest total cost is 172,000, the lowest total cost is 142,000, the highest output level is 90,000, and then the lowest activity level or output level is 60,000. So once we have these preambles, our total output level is $170,000. Then the minimum is 140,000 divided by the output, 90,000 for the maximum and then 60,000 for the minimum. So when we do this, the value we get is $1 per unit. So this $1 per unit is called the variable cost per unit, right? The variable cost per unit. But the question we need to ask ourselves is, now that we find the variable cost per unit, how do we find the fixed cost? To find the fixed cost, we are going to use the highest activity level and the highest total cost so that we can determine the fixed cost of the organization. Now you know that total cost is equal to your fixed cost plus variable cost. So if we are looking for our fixed cost, if you are looking for this fixed cost, the fixed cost is going to be your total cost minus your variable cost. And we are going to be using the maximum outputs as the basis for making this decision. So how do we get our fixed cost? Our total cost there is, for the maximum, is 170,000 minus variable cost at the maximum. Our variable cost per unit is $1, okay, times the output level at maximum, 90,000. So when we do that arithmetic, the fixed cost is going to give us $80,000. So do you see how the high and low method is working? We find our variable cost per unit. With that, we apply it to the maximum output, and then we use it to find the total fixed cost. So now we have our fixed cost to be 80,000, and we have our variable cost to be $1 per unit. Now, if you know your fixed cost is 80,000, you know that fixed costs remain the same irrespective of the output level. So back to the question. The question the examiner was asking us is, what cost should the organization, or what will be the cost in 2015 if the organization produces 85,000 units? That is cheap because we've done everything. So to get a total cost for 85,000 units, So total cost for 85,000 units. So to get total cost for 85,000 units, remember we said total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost. So the fixed cost in this case will be still 80,000, okay? Then your variable cost in this case will be the variable cost per unit. Now, variable cost per unit remains the same irrespective of the output level. This is one of the assumptions you have to also take in management accounting, that variable costs remain the same, variable cost per unit remain the same irrespective of the output level. So variable cost per unit will still be $1. Then our unit here is 85,000. So $1 by 85,000, I think that will still be $85,000. So the total cost to be incurred is going to be 165,000. So this is the total cost that will be incurred if the 85,000 units of product is produced in the year 20X5. And that is what you must understand when it comes to classification of cost. Now, this high and low method must be at your fingertip because the examiner can call you on to look at it under short-term decision making, to look at it under job costing or under process costing or under whatever, because determination of the variable cost per unit is fundamental to the job of the management accountant. So I will see you in the next module where we talk about accounting for material.